Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our Way Forward Workshop, Leader Lunch Break. We are pleased today to welcome Karen Long. Karen is the face and the driver of the Anisfield-Wolf Book Awards. Anisfield-Wolf Book Awards were founded in 1935 and remain the only juried prize awarded annually for the best books that confront racism and contribute to our understanding of our multicultural human race. Karen herself is a writer. She worked for many years at the Plain Dealer as investigative reporter, writer for religion and ethics, science writer, and most recently as book editor before leaving in 2013 to join the Cleveland Foundation in this role. She continues as a literary critic today. You may have read her reviews in Newsday, the Los Angeles Times, the Seattle Times, and other publications. She is well recognized for her talents as the recipient of a Penny Missouri Award for the Best Magazine Feature and Associated Press Award for the Best Feature Writing. She is an avid reader who studied at Oxford, and she is also one of Cleveland Magazine's most interesting people in Cleveland. Most importantly, she is a proud member, note I did not say graduate, proud member of the Leadership Cleveland class of 2020, and I know you have a small cheering section from that class with you here today. Karen, thank you for joining us and enlightening us about this important prize.
Thanks, Marianne. And thanks, Rachel and Bob and Lenora and Michael and Andrew. Feel very lucky and privileged to join this forum. I'll spend a few minutes on how we got here and then talk about this year's bouquet of winners. In 2007, the historian Taylor Branch, there at the left of your slide, won the Lifetime Achievement Award. He looked out at the crowd and he asked, "So what happened here in Cleveland? What made people start asking in 1935, where are the best books about racism?" The audience shrugged, looked around. Next slide. But the answer, as it often does, boils down to one person, Edith Anisfield-Wolf. She doesn't look like much of a revolutionary, does she? But she bet the family fortune that books could move the needle on this bedeviling question of our societal racism. Next slide. So it's fair to ask, do books change society? Whether you've read one of these four or not, they've remade your world. On the Origin of the Species by Charles Darwin, The Second Sex by Simone de Beauvoir, Things Fall Apart from Chinua Achebe, and of course, the King James Bible. Next slide. Closer to our own times, consider marriage equality. I believe a chunk of this progress dates to Angels in America, a 1993 watershed drama set amidst the AIDS epidemic. It gave playgoers and later viewers a deeper connection to the LGBT community. Next slide. So what do we know about Edith? Not much. Her parents were immigrants here, and when she was 12 in 1901, her father invited her to think with him about what to do with the family fortune. Mind you, that was 2 decades before the 19th Amendment. Next slide. So John Anisfield died in 1930, and for 5 years, his daughter mourned him, and in 35 decided to start this prize in his honor. She didn't tell us why. Edith's life was entirely segregated, yet war clouds in the 30s were gathering over Europe, and Jews, including her relatives, were imperiled. Next slide. So who's won in Anisfield-Wolf? Zora Neale Hurston, the Harlem Renaissance genius, Martin Luther King Jr. when he was an obscure preacher from Georgia, Gunnar Myrdal for An American Dilemma, Maxine Hong Kingston, Junot Diaz. 6 of the winners went on to win Nobel Prizes. Next. Including Toni Morrison, born just 35 miles west of here in Lorraine in 1931. Her parents both came north from Alabama in the Great Migration. If they hadn't, America's Nobel laureate in literature wouldn't have been allowed to get a library card. Next slide. About 15 years ago, the New York Times polled critics asking the best novel of the past quarter century. The consensus was Morrison's masterpiece, Beloved. That novel is set in a haunted Cincinnati house. Morrison based it on the true story of a woman who killed her child rather than see her return to slavery. Next. Sometimes on my rounds, I'm asked, why should we remember something as horrible as slavery? Isn't the Anisfield-Wolf Book Awards making matters worse? And there's a one-word answer: history. History helps us grasp how we got here, and we all stand in our identities, certainly, but books also give voice to what we long to become. Next slide. So, who should we be reading now? This is the class announced April 6th of Anisfield-Wolf Book Award winners. I'm going to try to provide you a speed date with each. Next slide. So speaking of history, this is a groundbreaking investigation into the roots, combatants, and reverberations of the largest slave revolt in the 18th century. Vincent Brown, a historian at Harvard, spent 12 years researching the coordinated strategic uprising in 1761 of enslaved peoples in Jamaica, and how their tactics were honed in Ghana and are recognizable to us today. Scattered militias opposing great powers, combatants indistinguishable from the people around them. War's generative role in fomenting slavery and racism are Brown's great themes. Next slide. So, Obit is Victoria Chang's fifth book. She distilled her grief during a feverish 2 weeks of writing after her mother died in 2015 into 70-ish obits because she liked the sound of that word and because she liked the long newspaper column obituaries run in that resembles a tombstone. She wrote about all she had lost in the world when her mother died. So one poem is called Appetite, another Oxygen, another The Blue Dress. The poems are repetitive in the way grief is both repetitive and asynchronous, lonely and universal. In a poem called The Head, Chang writes, "My mother now covered was no longer my mother. A covered apple is no longer an apple. A sketch of a person isn't the person. Somewhere in the morning, my mother had become the sketch, and I would spend the rest of my life trying to shade her back in," unquote. Deacon King Kong. Consider the two opening sentences. Deacon Cuffy Lampkin of Five Ends Baptist Church became a walking dead man on a cloudy September afternoon in 1969. That's the day the old deacon, known as Sports Coat to his friends, marched out to the plaza of the Causeway Housing Project in South Brooklyn, stuck an ancient .38 Colt in the face of a 19-year-old drug dealer named Dean Clemens, and pulled the trigger, unquote. This is James McBride at the height of his powers, writing a comic novel that is radical in its insistence good in flawed people will out. It has a lot to say about us. And if you can resist those first two sentences, you are made of stronger stuff than I am. Next slide. Memorial Drive. Our juror Simon Chema, the British historian, called this book an instant classic, not of just of memoir, but of literature itself. Poet Natasha Threadaway writes it to excavate and reclaim her mother's story. It had been reduced to a thumbnail notation that showed up when reporters covered Natasha or didn't show up at all. Her father was named as an important poet, and her mother, if she was mentioned as a victim, gunned down by an ex-husband when she was 40 and the author was 19. This book looks at the South, its history, the lack of care and protection we as a society afford Black bodies, particularly Black women, and it restores the complexity of a woman and a mother-daughter relationship. I could not recommend it more highly. Next slide. So here is our Lifetime Achievement winner. Samuel R. Delaney, known to his friends as Chip Delaney. This gay, Black science fiction and fantasy writer who just turned 79 broke all the molds with gusto and bravery, selling millions of books like Dahlgren and Babel 17 and The Motion of Light and Water. He proudly identifies as a pornographer. I don't know what Edith would think of that, but I received calls and messages from all over the country congratulating us for choosing him, for seeing him, which is the point, I think, of the Anisfield-Wolf. And I predict he will have the longest autograph lines this fall if we're able to gather. Next slide. So if this speed date has succeeded, I encourage you to visit our website and, next slide, check out the podcast, which is in its shakedown season, but is a lot of fun. And I hope that you will take pride in this locally grown canon of anti-racist literature that's 85 years old and awaiting you. Thank you for your kind attention.
Karen, thank you so much. And what a fabulous array of books this year. Now we're going to move to our Q&A. So for those on the call, if you have any questions for Karen, be sure to put those in the chat. But to start, Karen, can you share a bit about the nomination process, the jury, and how that selection process happens each year?
Thanks. That's an excellent question. We have public submissions, which means about 400 books roll in. A copy each for all 5 jurors. It's done in the old-fashioned print way. And the jurors themselves are all looking for books. They are Henry Louis Gates Jr., Rita Dove the poet, Simon Chema, who I mentioned, Joyce Carol Oates, and Steven Pinker. They've been a cohort for a very long time, since 1995, except for Pinker, who replaced Stephen Jay Gould when he died so young. So the jury's scanning, I'm logging in the books, and I'm writing a précis on each one, just a few paragraphs. And it's not as daunting as it sounds because the jury only wants a book that will be read in 100 years. And that is almost no book that will be published in the year we're working in. So if there's a B+ or an A-, not really interested. And they're so serious about that they will skip a category if no book has reached that threshold.
So as you think about the past few years, what trends has the award seen over the years in terms of topics, authors, content, and where are authors and books headed?
not a small question. It's interesting because Cleveland Magazine interviewed me this morning to do a little profile on these books. And they asked me if Black Lives Matter and the post-George Floyd reckoning has changed the prize. And I quoted what Simon Schama says, which is, everybody is trying to catch up with what Edith saw in 35, and very few people who held power saw. As far as what the trends are, Patrick knows this because I talk about this. You can think about these books in terms of enfranchisement. So when the country started, the only people with enfranchisement were white men with property. And you can think of the country as a table with leaves being added and other groups being invited to sit down. So when Edith began, she was thinking Black, white, and Jewish, I think mostly, but subsequently LGBTQ, disability rights, post 9/11 tensions between Muslim and other faiths have all entered the canon. And I think the big question in Anisfield-Wolf is, who don't we see? Who will our descendants be embarrassed that we aren't seeing now?
So Karen, you mentioned a few of the categories that the group reviews. Can you share what those categories are? And is this open to any particular type of book, poetry? What styles do you look for?
So we try to fling the doors wide with an idea toward excellence, equity, and abundance. But there are very few books that actually climb that mountain beautifully. And I'm proud to say the books are readable before they're anything else. So when Edith began, she began with that book for her father. It was a research book. And she quickly saw she needed what she called a creative book, work of nonfiction. So for quite a long while, the awards chugged along that way. And we added poetry in 2016, which I lobbied a couple years to do, noticing what poetry was doing in and for the culture. What a gateway it is, what a driver. How people who won't read a long history will have access to poetry on YouTube. I see Alexandria Romanoff here, and she interviewed the magnificent Ilya Kaminsky when he won for Deaf Republic in 2020. And what we're finding out with the podcast is there's lots of people also who won't read the book or even look at a documentary, who will listen to the work. And poetry is built for that. So we have poetry, fiction, nonfiction, and then lifetime achievement was added in the 80s. And the dirty secret in the awards game is lifetime achievement is the way to clean up your mistakes. If you've missed somebody, you can cuddle up to them on the Lifetime Achievement Award and kind of make up for the lack of original vision.
So as you look at celebrating the authors this year, what are some of the fun virtual events that you may have to highlight these authors?
So thank you for that question, Rachel. We start thinking for once they're announced about how to create an experience for them that smells like Cleveland, that isn't just an anonymous auditorium with people clapping, which, to be frank, most people don't think of as an exceptionally good time to sit around applauding for 90 minutes. So in that search, we look for an opportunity where the book intersects with us. So when Adrian Matika won for The Big Smoke, which is a collection of poems about the boxer Jack Johnson, he read in a boxing gym on the canvas with the microphone coming down between bouts of boxing. And it was such a glorious occasion because we mixed the hipsters who come out for poetry with the boxing community. And cuts were being sealed with Vaseline and books were getting signed. And I don't know a lot about boxing, but it's a radically equitable space. there's no VIP section around the ring, right? So that is one example. A more recent one is Tommy Orange winning for There, where we hosted him at St. John's Episcopal Church in Hingetown, which for a while in the 70s was the home of the American Indian movement. And LENAC, Lake Erie Native American Council, brought in dancers and music and food to sing and surround Tommy Orange with us, and messages of welcome and for travelers from the tradition that made him cry before he even got to the podium. So that's kind of what we try to do, but we don't think of it like that. It'll take a few months to stand it up. Last year, Patrick rode to the rescue when we were all virtual by ginning up this beautiful group of documentaries and short films that were Anisfield-Wolfian in nature. And so we offered them free via the website as a way to, again, build a new ramp into this thinking and learning.
We have had a few questions come in about, among the winners this year, what might be the best books for a young audience and how they might be used to help increase understanding of racism in the community?
That is such a great question. The jury gets pressure pretty frequently to add a young writers, young authors category, and they don't see themselves as expert enough in that. I will say with this group of winners, we have a beautiful seminar that runs every summer for people who teach with the books. We're adding in HBCUs virtually this year, and the group has decided to focus on Memorial Drive. And I can see that book resonating with a young reader. It's short. Because Threadaway is a poet, every word is worth reading. And it speaks to some eternal questions about how we see one another within family, how we make family, and how our family is read by outsiders. So when Natasha's parents married, it was illegal in Mississippi. They had to come to Ohio to do it. I think that would be a good book for a young reader, a family, or a classroom.
Can you tell us a bit more about the criteria, excellence, equity, and abundance? And what is the abundance?
Thank you, Joan. Thank you for lifting that up. This is a little inside baseball, but the Cleveland Foundation is doing very hard and necessary work on its own strategic planning. And the arts and culture segment of which Anisfield-Wolf is a part is trying to understand the grant-making work and what we hope to foster in Cleveland. And my thesis for our group is that before we had the language, Edith had the practice. By putting together the idea of equity, excellence, and abundance, she blew the minds of majority culture every year, forget where the good stuff is. And Diaz put it as people make the mistake of going to New York, thinking that's where they need to be to create art. And that the true vision is on the margins, because that's where, from the place from which you can see farther. So we took this idea Edith kind of incubated for us and asked in the arts, what is that triad that instead of scarcity, which is the bugbear of so much of our lives and work, what if we conceived of arts in abundance? And if art was abundant, how would it look in our communities? So that's kind of how the language is circling around.
So there's been a few questions about previous winners. And so how do we not lose the works of the earlier winners and keep them at the top of our reading lists?
That's a really interesting question. And I'm going to cop to the fact that there are a few turkeys on the list, but the awards read us, right? And some of our blind spots over such a long stretch of time. I see Octavia Butler mentioned, and it is a writer around whom I hang my head that we missed her, who is just renewing in the culture right now as such an important force in fiction, because science fiction is another way to think about morality. So as far as the canon goes, the books kind of talk to and with each other, critique each other. And we have an interesting forum coming up in May at the Maltz around the celebration of Ruth Bader Ginsburg. There's a Women Who Roar series, and Anisfield-Wolf will have a session to talk about some of the women in the canon, but also the women who didn't make the canon, how trans women don't make the canon. So there's a huge conversation in that. And our strategy, Rachel, is to try every year to add more people teaching from it, sort of seeing it in their work as a through line. It's really well suited to college in particular, because these books are about identity and people are forming their identities in college.
So looking back to Edith, did she get to appreciate the impact of her vision?
It's a really good question. One of the Anisfield-Wolf scholars, Dr. Lisa Nielsen at Case, has plans to write a biography of Edith. And I don't think I can know the answer to that. For most of the 85 years, it was a quiet check writing operation. And it was Steve Minter and Henry Louis Gates Jr. who said, how can it be a little bit more about Cleveland? So they started with a quiet tea, I think in 1996, and now it's built into Book Week. And with the documentary going across the country that Ideas Stream so beautifully made, it is moving out into the world. And I don't have a hologram of her to consult, but I hope she's happy.
So Karen, what impact do you hope the competition has on the community?
So I think a lot of us have been through REI training, Racial Equity Institute training, that talk about fish and lake and groundwater. And the fish are the winners in the individual books. And the lake is our region. And the groundwater is what feeds it. And so you can think of these books as trying to get in the groundwater. You know, I really love that people ask me a question like, aren't you making things worse? Because it's an honest question. And we know at least half the country holds it. So how do we look, if these are not off to the side, but more central in how we form our civic lives?
We have time for one more quick question. Out of thinking of the lists and the books you've been exposed to, do you have a favorite you could share?
Oh my heavens, you're asking me to choose among my children who all think I favor the others. It's really hard because they speak to us at different times in our life and on different occasions. I think Victoria Chang coming out of the pandemic is really salutary for us to dip into. But I have to tell you, if I could have put my thumb on the scale for Deacon King Kong, I would have, because to have a little comedy, a little bit of the truth that gets drunk, a very somber canon is just crack cocaine for me. Like, let's go.
Oh, Karen, that's wonderful. Thank you so much for sharing your passion for this space and all of the work you do in the community. We are so grateful. And we will be sure to share the link to the website afterwards so everyone can learn more about this year's winners and also check out the past winners to make sure that we keep them on our reading list.
Well, you've made me a better person through Leadership Cleveland. I'm better at my work. So thank you to your team.
Karen, thank you. And I'm going to turn it back to Mary Ann.
Thank you, Rachel. Karen, those are truly meaningful words, particularly coming from you. Thank you. And that hologram of Edith is not just smiling, she is absolutely beaming with where you have taken her vision and where you are taking our community. So thank you for the work that you do every day and for making time for us today.